In this tutorial series, we are going to take what we've been doing with Illustrator and add a little bit of complexity to it. We are going to reproduce this illustration here. And in so doing, we are going to touch on almost all the major elements that we need to understand about working with Illustrator, including the Layers panel, the Effects panel, including 3D, and the Appearance panel. Along the way, we'll also touch on most of the major tools in the toolbox. So let's begin. What I want you to do is come to the File drop-down menu and select New. I want you to choose 8.5 by 11, as we've been working with, and make the orientation horizontal as I have here. I'm going to say Create. This artboard is the space that we are going to work within. So before we do anything here, let's come back to the sample illustration and take a look at what is going on here. We have a fairly simple illustration, but it is complex in the sense that it is layered. We have a perspective that we have to maintain. We have things that are in front, in the foreground, midground, and background, and all those things need to be considered. But we can do ourselves a lot of favors by using layering. Let me show you what I mean. In this illustration here, if I come over to the Layers panel and open that up, you can see that we have all the layers of this illustration from back to front in our Layers panel. And of course, in the Layers panel, those layers that are on the top will be in front of those layers that are below them or behind them in the illustration. Organizing this before we even start putting shapes into our illustration would be the smart first step. So let's do that. I'm going to come back here to my Illustrator file. I have just the one layer here. Let's begin by naming this layer. I'm going to begin with the background layer. I'm going to double click that. I'll call this Sky. And I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to come down to the bottom of my Layers panel and click on this icon right here. That's the Create New Layer icon. And as you can see, the new layer gets put on top of the layer that you had previously selected. In my illustration, the next layer above the sky is the tree layer. I'm going to double click that, type in tree. I'm going to come back down to the bottom of my Layers panel to click the Create New Layer icon. The next layer is my fence layer. I'm going to double click that and call that fence. Create a new layer. This will be my house layer. Create a new layer. Double click that. Call this ground. We'll create a layer for the daisies. I'll create one last layer here. I'll double click that and call that letterbox. Now there might actually be more layers here than I really need. But as we'll see later, I can always combine layers together or create new layers later on. But this is a good place to start. Now that I've got my layers created, let's start putting artwork onto these layers. Whenever starting an illustration, I always like to begin with the biggest shapes first. Let me come back over here to my sample illustration and take a look at this. In this illustration, the largest shapes are the sky and the ground. Both of those can be created with simple large rectangles. Let's block those in first. I'm going to come to my illustration. I'm going to choose my sky layer. Now I want to be careful here. I don't want to put artwork onto the wrong layer. I could, if I'm concerned about this, lock all these layers by clicking on the lock icon for each of them. And that way I will prevent myself from accidentally working on the wrong layer. Let's take this Layers panel and float it out of the panel stack so that it's easily seen. I'm going to click on the name Layers and drag that out like so. I'm going to close these other panels by clicking on that double-headed arrow. I'm just going to drag this over to the side so I can see this a bit better. Let's begin by putting in a shape for the sky on the sky layer. I'm going to come over to my toolbox and I'm going to choose my rectangle tool. I'm going to just start my rectangle at the top left corner and drag down to the bottom right corner. Let's come over to our color panel and let's choose our sky color. Now we're going to be exploring digital color in much more detail very soon. What we see here are the RGB red, green, and blue color sliders for our screen's process colors. For now, I just want you to choose a light blue color or whatever color you want your sky to be from the color spectrum down here. I'm going to keep my sky color fairly conventional. One more thing I want to do with this shape, I don't want there to be a black outline around my sky, so I'm going to bring my stroke indicator forward and set that to none. I'm going to close my color panel. I now have a shape on my sky layer. In fact, I don't need to do anything else with this for now, so I'm going to lock that layer. I'm now going to unlock my ground layer by clicking on that lock icon. It is now unlocked. I do need to select that layer in order to work on it, however. Let's come back over to our toolbox and choose the rectangle tool. I'm going to draw in the ground so that it fills the bottom quarter of my composition here. But before I do that, I'm going to come over to my color panel and bring my fill indicator forward and choose a green color for my ground, something like that. And I'm just going to, like I say, about the bottom quarter of my illustration, like so. And I'm just going to drag it from edge to edge of my composition. Close my color panel. Let's come back to my layers panel. I've now put in the ground. I now have the sky. I've got the large shapes put in. Again, I like to start with the largest shapes first. So that if I come back to my sample illustration, the next largest shape after the ground and sky is the house itself. Let's come back to my illustration. I'm going to lock the ground layer. I don't want to work on that anymore. Let's come here to the house layer, select that. The house layer is currently locked, so let me unlock that like so. Again, let me come back to the house illustration. As you can see, the house is made up of two geometric shapes, a rectangle for the bottom and a triangle for the top. So let's make our house using those shapes. So I'm going to come back here to my illustration, and on the house layer, I'm going to again use my rectangle tool, and I'm going to draw a rectangle roughly in my composition like so. My shape has the appearance of the last shape I had selected, which was the ground, of course, so that is green. Let's change the color of that by coming over to our color panel and making sure our fill indicator is forward and setting that to pink, or whatever color you would like to make. And you can see here that I've created the ground in front of the house so that it feels as if that house is sitting on top of that ground. But what if I don't want it that way? What if I wanted there to be a little bit of perspective so that the house is in front? In that case, I could rearrange my house and my ground layer and bring my house above my ground layer. I'm going to click and hold on my house layer. And if I click and hold and drag as I'm holding that mouse layer, you can see that my cursor turns into this hand, and that blue line gives me an indication of where I can drag that layer to. I could drag it below this layer, or I could drag it above. So let's take that house layer and drag it above the ground layer. And now you can see that we now have introduced a little bit of perspective into our illustration. My next shape is the triangle that makes up the roof of this house. I'm going to come back over to my toolbox. And as I'm going to be working with these shape tools quite a bit, let's click and hold on this tool and release over top of this tear off button so that I can float these tools in their own toolbox over here. As I mentioned, I want to use the triangle tool, but as I look at these tools here, I don't see a triangle tool. However, we do have a polygon tool. If I select the polygon tool and then click and drag, you can see that it gives me a hexagon for my shape, which is not what I want. I'm going to press the delete key to get rid of that. In order to turn my hexagon into a triangle, I'm going to come back over to my polygon tool, again, select it. This time, rather than clicking and dragging, I'm going to click somewhere on my artboard once. And here in this polygon dialog box, I can reduce the number of sides down to 3. So I now have this triangle, but I have some issues. First of all, it's not in the right place. It's also not the right size. Both of these things I can easily change using the black arrow tool. Let's first of all reposition this. What I'd like to do is have this aligned to the rectangle shape below. There is a way that I can align this perfectly. I can turn on Smart Guides. You may in fact have Smart Guides turned on by default. I don't currently have my Smart Guides on, so I'm going to come to the View drop-down menu and select Smart Guides. I've now turned on Illustrator's helpful guides that can tell me things. For example, if I take this shape, Illustrator is giving me all sorts of indicators when I have things aligned with other shapes. If I move it to the left edge or to the right edge. But as I move this towards the center, you can see that there is my intersect of a line to center. Now that I know this is center aligned, I'm just going to move this down so that it's touching. Now that I have it in the right position, I now need to resize this. As we saw in an earlier video, we can use the bounding box anchor points to resize this. For example, if I stretch this out, you can see I can stretch that like so. But I don't want to do it like that. I want to be a bit more precise. I want to stretch this out horizontally, but still maintain my center alignment with the shape below. In order to do that, I'm going to hold down my Option key. As I hold that down, I'm going to click and drag on this right bounding box anchor point and drag out to the right. And now I can drag this to whatever width I want that to be. I now have the two shapes that are making up the shape of my house. Let's join these together using the Shape Builder tool. I'm going to select these two shapes together by holding down the Shift button and clicking on the bottom shape. I'm going to come over to my toolbox and I'm going to click on this tool here, the Shape Builder tool. The Shape Builder tool, as we saw from an earlier video, allows us to build shapes together. If I click and drag over top of two shapes, I can join them together like that. Now our two separate house shapes are one shape. Let's work on some of the other shapes for our house. If I come back to this sample illustration, let's create the door and the window next. Let's create our door. I'm going to use a rectangle tool, and I'm going to draw a door on the right-hand side of my house. Drag down this rectangle to the bottom of the house and release. As my sample illustration shows, I want there to be a white bit of trim around that door. I can do that by putting a stroke around my rectangle. I'm going to make one small change here to my interface before I proceed. As I start working with these other panels, this layer panel is getting in the way. I'm going to just drag mine over here. Let's come over here to our color panel. I'm going to change the color of this door by clicking down here. I'm just going to make this a little bit of a darker red like that. But like the sample illustration, I want there to be a little bit of white trim around the door, so I'm going to bring the stroke indicator forward and set that to white. Let's change the weight of that stroke. Right now it's only 1 point, very thin. So I'm going to come over here to the stroke panel, and there is the weight value, basically the thickness of that line. I can increase that by clicking on the up arrow. I think the thickness of about 6 points is fine. I'm going to close that. If I click off, though, I can see I have a bit of an issue. The bottom of this rectangle also has a white stroke at the bottom. This is a problem. Let's fix that. I'm going to come over to my toolbox and choose my zoom tool. I'm going to zoom in to the bottom of this door by clicking on it a couple of times with my zoom tool. What I want to do is get rid of this bottom white line segment. As we know, we can select parts of shapes if I use the white arrow, the direct selection tool. I'm going to use that direct selection tool, and I'm going to be very careful to hover over top of the bottom of the door until I see the word path emerge. I'm going to click once to select it. To delete it, I just need to press the delete key on my keyboard. And now my door and its trim meet the bottom of the house. Just going to zoom out just a little bit. I want to work on the rest of the door. Let's come back here to the sample illustration though. I'm going to zoom into this door here and take a look. You'll notice that it has what's called a half-moon window. This is a classic design, but it's a fairly complex shape. But we can create this shape fairly easily using one of Illustrator's hidden shape creation tools. Let's come back to our illustration. Let me show you how we're going to create that shape. I'm going to come over here to my toolbox. We've been working with these geometric shape tools here, but there's some other shape tools that we haven't looked at yet. If I click and hold on this line segment tool, you'll see that there is another subset of shape tools available for us to play with. Let's click on the tear off button over here and float those out into their own panel as well. There are some interesting tools, but the one I want to take a look at is this one here, the Polar Grid tool. I'm going to click and drag with this tool and hold down the shift button to constrain it to a perfect circle. And you can see what this tool does by default. Well, that isn't quite what I'm looking for, so I'm going to press the delete button. How do I make changes to it? Well, I'm going to click once with my Polar Grid tool somewhere on my artboard. The first thing I'm going to do is click inside where it says concentric dividers and change the number from 5 to 0. For the radial dividers, I'm going to change that to 6. I'm going to say OK. And there's our polar grid. This is close, but we need to get rid of a couple of sections. I'm going to use my shape builder tool over my toolbox again to do this work. I'm going to click on that. And again, like last time, it has the plus sign by the cursor. But as we saw in a previous video, we can subtract shapes from one another when we press the Option button. And you'll see here that my shape builder tool now shows a minus sign. If I hover over top of the right-hand side of this circle, I'm just going to press once. We're almost there. Still holding down the Option button, I'm going to hover over the remaining 2 lines. 1, 2. What remains should be our half-moon window. Let's just change the rotation. I could use the selection tool and rotate it using the bounding box, but there is a rotation tool, and there is an interesting reason to use it. When I choose the rotation tool, and if I zoom in, Command plus sign on my keyboard, you can see that there is a very small light blue crosshairs. That is the center point around which the rotation will occur. I can change that just by clicking on it and dragging it to some other point. And then when I click and drag, you'll notice that my object now rotates around this new point. Whatever point I choose to rotate around, as long as I press the Shift button as I rotate, I will rotate that to the position that I want it to be. Let me reposition this in my screen a little bit better. I'm going to press my space bar to reveal my hand tool so I can pan that over into my screen like that. I'm going to use my black arrow to reposition this into my door. Holding down the Shift button, I'm going to scale that down to about that size. Finally, I want this to look like there's glass inside here, so I'm going to change the color of that by coming to the color panel, bringing my fill indicator forward and setting that to blue. Now I have a bit of an issue with the placement of this window in this door. If I move there, there is my center point. One more shape that I need to create for my door, and then I'm going to come over here to my ellipse tool to create the doorknob. And again, that's just going to be a simple circle. I'm going to hold down the shift button to create a perfect circle. It's got the appearance of the moon window I just had. I'm going to bring my color panel forward and set my stroke to none. Let's create our next shape. If I come back over here to my house illustration, the next shape I want to create is this window with its window panes. Again, there's a special tool that I want to use in Illustrator to do this. I'm going to come back to my illustration. Back here in my line segment toolbox, right next to my polar grid tool, there is something called the rectangular grid tool. If I click on that and then click and drag over my illustration, you can see that by default, it gives me a grid with 6 rows and 6 columns, which is not what I want. I'm going to press the delete key on my keyboard. Again, like the other tools, we can change the default appearance of this grid tool. If I click once on my artboard to reveal the rectangular grid tool options. For the horizontal dividers, I want this to be just 1. For the vertical dividers, I also want that to just to be 1. I'm going to say OK. There's my window with its window panes. I'm going to change the stroke weight by clicking on the up arrow, and I'm going to make that again 5. I want this window to have the same fill color as this shape. There is a very handy tool in our toolbox that allows us to copy the appearance of one object into another one. If I come over to my toolbox and select my eyedropper tool, while my window is selected, I can click on some other object, for example, this Halfmoon Window, and this window now takes on the appearance of this object. I'm going to select my black arrow again by pressing V on my keyboard, and I can now position that over here. I'm going to press Command 0 on my keyboard to position that back into the center of my screen. So we're not quite done with the house, but we are going to add some more detail a little bit later on. However, I would like to move to the next biggest object in our illustration. Let's come back to our sample, and the next largest shape that we need to consider is the tree. But the tree will be interesting because this opens up all sorts of new areas in Illustrator that we have yet to discover, including brushes and effects. Let's come back to our illustration. The first thing I'm going to do is make sure that I'm working on the correct layer. I'm going to come back here to my house layer, and I'm going to just lock that so I don't accidentally work on that. And I'm going to unlock my tree layer. I'm also going to select that layer so that I can now work on it. The first thing I'm going to do is make the tree trunk and tree branches. And I'm going to do that by using one of my favorite things in Illustrator, a custom art brush. Let me show you what I'm talking about. The primary shape of a tree trunk and a tree branch is essentially a very elongated triangle. So let's create that shape first. I'm going to do that by zooming out just a little bit, and I'm going to press my space bar to get my hand tool. And I'm going to open up a little bit of space above my artboard here. This is where I'm going to assemble my custom art brush. I'm going to use my pen tool. The pen tool, we know from a previous video, allows us to create precise curves. But in this case, it's going to work perfectly for us to create the shape that we need. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a very long triangle that looks like it is laying on its side. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to click once to get an anchor point like that. I'm going to move directly down from that anchor point, not very far. You can see I've got my smart guides on, and it's telling me the distance that I've traveled here. I'm going to move roughly about roughly about a third of an inch down from the original anchor point. I'm now going to move across my artboard. I'm just going to click there to create an anchor point there, and I'm going to finish this shape by coming back with my pen tool, clicking on the original anchor point. I now have a very long triangle lying on its side. Why is it on its side? Well, I find that custom art brushes made in Illustrator work a little bit better when they are created horizontally. Now, the issue I have with this graphic right now is that it's got the appearance of the last object I had selected, the white stroke and blue fill of the window. Let's change that. I'm going to come over to my selection arrow. I'm going to come over here to my color panel, and I'm going to bring my fill indicator forward and select a brown from my color spectrum down below here. I'm also going to change the stroke color by bringing the stroke indicator forward and setting that to none. Now I'm going to take this shape and I'm going to convert that into a brush by coming over to my brushes panel in my panel stack, clicking on that once. Now we are going to get more involved with the brushes panel in a later exercise. what we are seeing here right now is only a preview of the different types of brushes that Illustrator has pre-installed. We are going to add our graphic into this brushes panel by clicking on the panel options button in the top right and selecting new brush. From this new brush panel, we are going to choose the type of brush that we want. Like I say, we are going to get into this in much more detail later, but for now, let's choose Art Brush. And I'm going to say OK. One more dialog box here. We are not going to change anything in this panel, and I'm going to come down to the bottom and say OK. Now that we have that graphic as a brush in the Brushes panel, we can apply that brush to other vector paths. Let me show you what I'm talking about. I'm going to come over to my toolbox, and I'm going to click and hold on the Shaper tool to reveal the subset of tools. The tool that I want to work with is this one here, the Pencil tool. I can press N on my keyboard if that's my keyboard shortcut. On my tree layer, I'm going to take that Pencil tool and I'm going to click down on the ground and draw up a nice curvy line that goes to about that height. This vector path, if I come over to my color panel, you can see that currently has no stroke and a brown fill color. The first thing we need to know is that brushes are only applied to strokes, not to the fill. And since this shape has no stroke color, we have nothing to apply the brush to. So let's flip this. I'm going to just click on this little icon here that allows us to swap the stroke and fill colors. I've now made the stroke color the brown color. The next thing I have to do is apply the brush that we've just made to this vector path. Let's come over to my brushes panel, and I'm going to click this new art brush that we've just made once. And now you can see how our triangular vector graphic is being applied to that vector path. With my pencil tool still selected, I can draw more branches. Remember, each line that we draw is a stroke, meaning that if I come over to my stroke panel, I can use the stroke weight field to change that brush. I'm going to click here on the preset triangle to reveal that in fact we can go down to as small as 1/4 of a point in line weight. Let me keep drawing more branches. Once you have the branches of your tree drawn in, it's time to put in the leaf shapes. Let's take a look at our sample illustration to see how that was handled. You can see here that the shapes that make up the leaves of the tree are in behind the branches that I've just drawn. And they also have a very rough edge around the outside. Let's see how we're going to do that. I'm going to come back to my illustration. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to draw in the shapes that will become the leaves of our tree. I'm going to come over to my toolbox and choose the ellipse tool. If I hold down the shift button and draw out a circle, you'll see that my circle has the brush that I've just been applying to my branches. Let's change that before we do anything else. Let's come over to my color panel. I'm going to get rid of this stroke by bringing the stroke indicator forward and setting that to none. I'll bring the fill indicator forward and I'm going to choose a green from my color spectrum down here. I'm going to use my black arrow to position this circle over one of the branches of the tree. Now currently this shape is in front of my branches, but we saw from the sample illustration that we wanted these shapes to be behind the branches. Let's reorder that here. I'm going to, with that shape still selected, I'm going to come to the Object drop-down menu, and I'm going to select Arrange, Send to Back. And you can see here that this shape has now been sent behind all the other shapes on this tree layer. Now that I've got that shape behind the branches, I'm going to duplicate it a few times by selecting it and holding down the Option button so that I see the double-headed arrow. Click and drag another instance of that shape out. I'm going to do that a few more times, being careful not to accidentally click on the branches. And as you can see here, I'm just giving my tree a little bit of shape. Perhaps I'll put one in the middle like so. You can resize these shapes as you see fit. What I'd like to do now that I've got those shapes created is take all these green ellipses and group them together. It'll help as I proceed, especially when I add effects. Now we've already talked about how we can select multiple objects by clicking on one object and holding down the Shift button and selecting another. But there's another way to select multiple objects where selecting a number of individual objects by hand may prove tedious or even impossible. Watch this. I'm going to select all the objects that share my current selection's color. I'm going to come to the Select drop-down menu, and I'm going to select by same fill color. You can see Illustrator has now chosen for me all the shapes that had that same fill color. That can save me a lot of time. Now that I have them all selected, I want to group them as one object. Again, I'm going to come to the Object drop-down menu and select Group, or Command-G on my keyboard, a very good keyboard shortcut to know. Now, all of those shapes are grouped together. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to click off over here so that nothing is selected. Now, when I hover over one of these and click, all of the shapes that are grouped together are now selected, which is very handy because the next thing I want to do is add a roughen effect to all these shapes to make it look more like a leafy tree. With that group selected, I'm going to come to the Effect drop-down menu, and I'm going to choose Distort and Transform. And from that menu, I'm going to choose Roughen. Now already you can see the preview showing me how that roughen effect will be applied. But we have some options here that we can play with. I'll let you experiment with some different options. But you can see that we can get to a point where this can start to look like a pine tree. I'm going to leave mine a little less pokey, something like that looks good. And I'm going to say OK. And I'm going to click off so we can see this a little bit better. Now we are almost done the first part of this tutorial, but before we end this video, I want to end with a very, very important idea. And that is the difference between an object's appearance and its underlying vector structure. Let me show you what I mean. These tree shapes, for example, have a rough appearance to them. But if I come to the View drop-down menu and choose Outline, I can see what this illustration would look like without its appearance. And you can see that, in fact, as far as Illustrator is concerned, those rough shapes are still perfect circles, as we see here. This is Illustrator's underlying vector structure. And this, when I come back to Preview, is Illustrator's appearance. For Illustrator, this shape is still just a circle with an effect on it. And that effect is what's controlling its appearance. And that appearance is always live and editable. And we can control the appearance of objects by coming over here to the Appearance panel. We've worked with several panels so far, but this Appearance panel is the most powerful of all of them. The reason being is that we can access almost all these other panels through this panel. And you can see that I have a group selected, and it has a roughen effect on it here. I can turn that effect on and off here in the Appearance panel, but I can also change the effect itself. By clicking on the word roughen, I can bring up that effects panel again. And perhaps I might want to make some changes in the roughen's effect. And you can see how those changes are applied in real time to those shapes. Again, this is really where Illustrator becomes very powerful. Its adaptability and editability. In our next video, we are going to build on some of the concepts that we've been talking about to finish up this illustration.